There is a board game sitting in a closet in almost every American home. You have played it. You know the streets without even thinking. Boardwalk, Park Place, Baltic Avenue, the railroads, the little silver shoe moving around the corner past Go. What almost no one remembers is that those streets were not made up by anyone. Someone copied them, one by one, off the map of a real city built on a thin strip of sand in southern New Jersey, a city that once pulled in more people across a single summer than New York and Philadelphia held between them, a city Americans crossed the country to see. Today, that same city is dying, not in a fire, not in a flood, quietly, one darkened building at a time, while the country that built it looks the other way. This is the story of a place that sold the American dream 3 separate times and lost it 3 separate times, and it begins at the very top. Begin in the 1920s when Atlantic City called itself the world's playground and meant it as a plain statement of fact rather than a slogan. In the peak weeks of summer, by the accounts of the day, close to 99 trains rolled in and out of the city in a single day. The town supported 4 daily newspapers and more than 20 theaters. Broadway producers used it as a testing ground, and the saying went that if a show could hold an audience here, it could hold one anywhere. People did not trickle in. They arrived by the hundreds of thousands on a good weekend. Clerks and shopgirls and factory families who could afford the cheap, fast fare down from Philadelphia, 90 minutes that shrank to 50 as the rail lines improved. What waited for them was unlike anything else in the country. The first thing they stepped onto was the Boardwalk, and it was the first of its kind anywhere. Born back in 1870 out of nothing more romantic than a complaint about sand. Guests kept tracking it into the hotel lobbies. A railroad conductor named Alexander Boardman and a hotel owner named Jacob Keem brought the problem to the city, and the city spent $5,000, roughly half its tax revenue that year, to lay a wooden walkway above the beach. By the 1890s, it ran for miles, stood 10 feet above the tide, and had become the most famous promenade in America. Attendants pushed visitors along it in wicker rolling chairs. Above the boardwalk rose the real monument to the city's golden age, and it climbed straight up. On a narrow island, the rarest thing on earth was a room facing the ocean, so the grand hotels were built tall and built to stun. By the late 1880s, there were already more than 500 hotels and boarding houses. The wooden ones gave way to something new after fire tore through the city. The Marlborough Blenheim, designed by the Philadelphia firm of Price and McClanahan, was poured out of reinforced concrete, one of the first major American buildings to use the material, and crowned with a Moorish dome and Spanish towers, hot and cold salt water running in every room. Winston Churchill slept there. Across the street stood the Traymore, 16 stories of tan brick and gold-capped towers, with bathtubs that ran 4 separate kinds of water. People called it the Taj Mahal of Atlantic City, a name that would come to mean something very different and very cruel 60 years later, and the city gave the country more than buildings. It gave it spectacle. Out on Steel Pier, opened in 1898 and billed as the showplace of the nation, crowds watched boxing matches and brass bands and, most famously of all, a horse that leapt from a tall platform into a pool of water far below. In September of 1921, a handful of local businessmen invented a small beauty contest to keep tourists in town past Labor Day. 7 cities sent young women. The first crown went to a 16-year-old from Washington named Margaret Gorman. They called it the Miss America pageant, and it would belong to Atlantic City for most of the next 80 years. By then, the place had so completely entered the national bloodstream that when the most popular board game in American history needed a map, it reached for these exact streets. The cheap squares took the names of Baltic and Mediterranean. The expensive corners took Park Place and the Boardwalk itself. Convention Hall, finished in 1929, was the largest auditorium on Earth. Fitted with a pipe organ so enormous it remains the biggest ever built. The city was no longer merely popular, it was inescapable. But every word of this, the hotels, the trains, the rolling chairs, the crown on the beach, rested on a single unspoken promise that the people would keep coming, that the next summer would be bigger than the last. The whole city, every concrete tower of it, was a bet that the crowds were permanent. They were not. And somewhere underneath all that glitter, in the very years it shone the brightest, the first thin crack had already begun to spread. The rescue, when it finally came, was wearing a uniform. In the summer of 1942, barely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Army marched onto the boardwalk and did not leave for 4 years. 47 hotels along the oceanfront and the side streets were handed over to the military and turned into barracks. The Grand Convention Hall became a training command center. One of the great Quaker hotels became a sprawling army hospital, for a time among the largest in the world. The whole town was rechristened Camp Boardwalk, and more than 300,000 soldiers passed through it before the war was over. For the hotels, it was a lifeline thrown at exactly the right moment. The Army paid only $1 a day for a room, which was almost nothing, but it filled every room every night with a certainty no summer season had ever offered. The long, flat boardwalk, it turned out, was nearly perfect ground for men learning to walk again on artificial legs. Bob Hope came to entertain the troops. Families took soldiers home for Sunday dinner, and for a few strange years the world's playground felt useful in a way that pure pleasure had never quite made it feel. Then the war ended, the soldiers went home, the hotels reopened their doors to vacationers, and for a little while, if you did not look too closely, everything seemed to pick up right where it had left off. The nightclubs were loud again. The famous 500 Club drew Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Over on Kentucky Avenue, the Great Review at Club Harlem ran its Saturday show so late into the night that it did not finish until Monday morning. The crowds still came. The pageant still crowned its queen on the beach each September. But something underneath had shifted, and it would take the better part of a decade to understand what. The thing that had built Atlantic City in the first place, the simple fact that it was the easiest place for millions of people in the crowded cities of the Northeast to reach the ocean, was quietly being taken away from it. And the instrument of the theft was not a rival city. It was a machine. 2 machines, really. The first was the airplane. After the war, commercial flight became something an ordinary family could afford, and an ordinary family with a week of vacation and a little money no longer had to settle for a train ride down to New Jersey. They could fly to Miami Beach, where the ocean was warm in the dead of winter and the hotels were brand new. A little later, they could fly to a strange, glittering town out in the Nevada desert called Las Vegas, where the one thing Atlantic City had always quietly sold: the chance to gamble, to drink, to misbehave far from home was now offered openly, legally, around the clock, in air-conditioned comfort. The second machine was smaller, and it sat in a window. Air conditioning. For 3/4 of a century, part of Atlantic City's entire reason for being had been the sea breeze, the escape from the breathless heat of the industrial city in July. A doctor had founded the place on the belief that the ocean air itself was a cure. But once a family could cool its own living room with the turn of a switch, the desperate need to flee the heat and the ocean that had always answered it simply evaporated. The automobile and the new highways finished the job, carrying Americans not toward Atlantic City, but straight past it, toward 1,000 other places that now lay within easy reach. The decline did not announce itself. It crept. The grand hotels grew shabby, paint peeled from the towers that had once dazzled. The visitors who still came were older, poorer, here for an afternoon rather than a season. The population of the city, which had peaked decades earlier, began a long and steady fall that would not stop for 40 years. And then, in the summer of 1964, the entire country got a clear look at what had happened. The Democratic Party chose Convention Hall to nominate its candidate for president, and the national press descended on Atlantic City, expecting the world's playground. What the reporters found instead, and what they described in their columns to the whole nation, was a tired, fraying town of empty storefronts and rundown hotels. People who walked the boardwalk in those years said that in the dead heat of summer, you could roll a bowling ball straight down it and not strike a single soul. It was not a figure of speech, it was simply the truth. The city that had been built on one promise was now watching that promise dissolve in front of it. And out of the desperation, a single dangerous idea was beginning to take shape, that somewhere out there was one last bet, one wager big enough to save everything. By the early 1970s, the city was dying in plain sight, and the men who ran it went looking for a miracle. They found one printed on a ballot. The pitch was simple, almost desperate in its logic. If people would no longer come to Atlantic City for the ocean, then give them a reason that no other city on the entire East Coast was permitted to offer. Give them the one thing the town had quietly sold under the table since the days of the old political bosses. Make it legal. Build casinos. The first attempt failed. In 1974, New Jersey's voters were asked to allow gambling anywhere in the state, and they refused. So the plan was rewritten, narrowed, and sharpened. This time the casinos would be locked inside a single struggling town, and the taxes they threw off would be promised to programs for the elderly and the disabled. In November of 1976, the voters approved it. With one mark on a ballot, Atlantic City became the only place in the United States, outside the Nevada desert, where an ordinary person could walk in off the street and legally place a bet. The state moved fast. The governor, Brendan Byrne, signed the Casino Control Act the following year and stood up to warn organized crime in language no one could misread, to keep its hands off the city. On the 26th of May, 1978, the first casino opened its doors. It was carved into the bones of an old hotel on the boardwalk, the same Quaker house that had once refused to serve a drop of liquor and had nursed wounded soldiers during the war. Now it was a casino, and the people came in a flood. The lines ran out the door and down the boardwalk. By many accounts, the place took in more money in its first months than its owners had ever dared to project. For one shining moment, the bet looked like pure genius. What followed was a gold rush. If one casino could do that, then everyone wanted in. Over the next few years, the towers went up along the Boardwalk and the marina, one after another. Caesars, Bally's, the Golden Nugget, the Tropicana, each one larger and more expensive than the last. National hotel chains arrived. Famous names arrived. And then, in the middle of the 1980s, a brash young developer from New York named Donald Trump arrived. And he did not build one casino. He built three. The last and largest of them, the Trump Taj Mahal, opened in 1990 as the most expensive casino ever raised in the city. A billion-dollar fantasy of domes and minarets and chandeliers. It was financed, like much of the boom around it, with mountains of borrowed money, the high-risk debt that bankers politely called junk. For a while, the numbers were staggering, and from a distance the skyline looked like a resurrection. But here is the cruel heart of the whole story, the thing almost no one wanted to say out loud while the money was pouring in. The casinos did not save Atlantic City. The casinos saved the casinos. They were built by design as sealed islands. A visitor could step off a chartered bus directly at the casino door, spend 10 hours inside under the lights with no clocks and no windows, eat in the casino's own restaurants, and step back onto the bus without ever once setting foot in the actual city. Everything a guest could possibly need was kept inside the walls, which meant the money stayed inside the walls too. It flowed in from the bus into the machines and back out to shareholders far away. Almost none of it ever reached the streets, and those streets needed it badly. Walk 1 or 2 blocks inland from the gleaming towers, and you found another city entirely. Boarded-up row houses, vacant lots choked with weeds, storefronts that had been dark for years. The promised revival of the neighborhoods, the new life the tax money was supposed to deliver, mostly never came. Through the entire casino boom, even as billions of dollars changed hands on the boardwalk, the population of Atlantic City kept right on falling. The towers rose and the town behind them sank. The city had made its deal. It had pawned its soul for one more chance to be the place where America came to misbehave. And the trouble with that kind of bargain is the same trouble that haunts every monopoly ever built. It is worth a fortune, right up until the moment someone else is finally allowed to do the very same thing. In 2006, the casinos of Atlantic City took in more than $5 billion. It was the most money the city had ever made. It was also the last good year it would ever have. Hidden somewhere inside that record-breaking total was the beginning of the end, because the one thing holding the whole empire up was about to be taken away. The monopoly was about to break. It broke the way the railroad monopoly had broken a lifetime before, not through any failure of Atlantic City, but because someone else was finally allowed to do the same thing. For decades, anyone in Philadelphia, in New York, in Baltimore who wanted to legally feed a slot machine had exactly one option within driving distance. Then, one by one, the neighboring states changed their laws. Connecticut had opened 2 enormous casinos in the woods back in the 1990s. But the blow that truly landed came from right next door. Pennsylvania legalized slot machines, and by 2006, its first gambling halls were opening their doors. Within a few short years, there were casinos in the Poconos, outside Philadelphia, all across the state. and a family in Philadelphia no longer had any reason at all to make the 60-mile drive down to the shore. The whole reason Atlantic City existed had just been planted in their own backyard. New York followed, then Delaware, then Maryland. The entire Northeast filled up with casinos, and every new one carved another slice out of Atlantic City's shrinking pie. The revenue that had peaked above $5 billion began to fall, and then it simply did not stop. It fell the next year and the next, and the year after that. By the middle of the following decade, it had been cut roughly in half. Then, in 2008, the financial crisis swept across the country, and people everywhere stopped spending money they no longer had. For a city that lived entirely on other people's spare cash and free time, it was a knife to an already bleeding patient. What came next came fast, like an avalanche that has finally let go of the mountain. In a single year, 2014, 4 of Atlantic City's casinos went dark. The Atlantic Club closed in January. The Showboat closed that summer while it was reportedly still turning a profit, for no reason other than that its owner had too many of its own casinos competing against each other. Trump Plaza closed in September, and so did the Revel. The Revel is the one that breaks your heart. It had opened only 2 years earlier in 2012. The single most expensive casino ever built in Atlantic City. Somewhere around $2.5 billion of glass and steel, rising 47 stories above the Boardwalk. It was meant to be the city's gleaming future. Instead, it became a museum of every wrong guess at once. It banned smoking, and the gamblers left. It built no buffet, and the bus crowd stayed away. It charged high prices, and everyone else stayed away too. It ran out of money before it was even finished. It went bankrupt twice, and it closed after 2 years and 5 months. A tower taller than almost anything else in New Jersey, standing empty and dark on the beach. It had cost $2.5 billion to build. It would later be sold for a tiny fraction of that, pennies more or less, on every dollar. Those 4 closings in that 1 year threw thousands of people out of work all at once, in a city that had nothing else to offer them. And then came the fall of the last great tower, the Trump Taj Mahal, the billion-dollar palace that had opened in 1990, gone bankrupt little more than a year after its own grand opening, and limped through decades under one restructuring after another, finally went dark in 2016, after a long and bitter labor dispute, under an owner whose name was no longer Trump at all. The most expensive casino in the city the day it opened had become just one more boarded-up building on a boardwalk full of them. By then the damage had spread past the casinos and into the city itself. As the gambling halls lost money, they fought their property tax bills and won, draining the local government of the revenue it depended on. Atlantic City's own books fell apart, and in 2016, the state of New Jersey stepped in and took control of the city's finances to keep it from going formally bankrupt. The city had stood in this exact place before. It had bet everything on a single card once, on the resort, and lost. Now it had done the very same thing again, on the casino, and lost again. 2 miracles, 2 collapses, and along the boardwalk, the towers that had each been built to save everything stood silent, one after another, with the lights switched off. On the morning of the 17th of February, 2021, a crowd gathered on the beach in Atlantic City to watch a building die. At the appointed second, a series of charges went off inside the old Trump Plaza, and the tower, once one of the gaudiest jewels on the boardwalk, where champions had fought and the famous had come to be seen, folded in on itself and dropped into a gray cloud of dust and rubble. It had stood vacant for years, dark and crumbling, pieces of its own facade falling onto the street below. In the end, the city paid to bring it down. People cheered, the way you might cheer at the end of a long illness. Then the dust settled, and where a tower had stood, there was only sky and the flat gray ocean behind it. That is what the fall of Atlantic City actually looks like. Not one single catastrophe, not a fire or a flood you could point to and say, there, that was the moment it happened. Just a slow, quiet coming apart, one dark building at a time, until one of them is finally reduced to dust on a beach while a crowd takes pictures. The strange part is that, by the numbers, the city is supposedly recovering. 9 casinos are still open today, after New Jersey legalized online gambling and then, in 2018, won a long fight all the way to the Supreme Court to legalize betting on sports. The total money flowing through the city's gambling industry climbed back up, and in some recent years it has set records. But look closer at where that money comes from, and the recovery turns to smoke. More and more of it arrives not from anyone walking the boardwalk, but from a phone, from someone sitting on a couch 100 miles away, who will never see the ocean, never book a room, never spend $1 on the actual city. The money has learned to skip the trip, and the in-person business, the people physically coming to town, still sits well below where it stood in 2006. 2 of the towers that went dark have flickered back to life under new names. The doomed Revel reopened as a different casino. The Taj Mahal reopened as a different casino. The city does what it has always done. It tears down, or renames, or repurposes whatever brought the last wave of people, and tries to use it to pull in the next. But the ground beneath the spectacle has not changed. Atlantic City remains one of the poorest cities in New Jersey. Its population is a fraction of what it was at its peak, when more than 60,000 people lived here. Walk a single block inland from the lights, and you are still standing in front of boarded windows and empty lots, in the long shadow of buildings worth billions of dollars. And here is the thing the tourists do not know. On a warm summer evening, the boardwalk is still beautiful. Families still walk it. They eat saltwater taffy and ride the rolling chairs and take their photographs against the glowing towers, and almost none of them realize they are standing on top of a graveyard, that beneath those new casinos and those vacant lots lie the buried foundations of the grandest hotels America ever built. The Traymore, the Marlborough Blenheim, palaces that once held presidents and is now a memory under somebody's parking garage. So why does a city like this die so quietly? Because it was never really a city at all. Not the way a city grows up around a harbor or a river or a reason for people to put down roots and build lives. Atlantic City was built to be an attraction. It was built to take money from people passing through and send them home again. And a place built only to be visited has nothing left to stand on the day the visitors find somewhere new to go. There is no second engine, no other reason to be. When the crowds leave, the lights just go out, slowly, one street at a time, and the people who actually live there are left behind in the dark. That is why Atlantic City should haunt us, because America has built places like it again and again. Boom towns and resort towns and company towns, whole communities thrown up overnight on a single promise of easy money. then abandoned without a backward glance the moment that promise stopped paying. Atlantic City is not an exception, it is a mirror. And in the quiet death of the world's playground, in the dust of a tower settling onto an empty beach, is the reflection of something this country has never quite wanted to look at directly. The plain, brutal truth that the dream was only ever as permanent as the profit, and the profit was never permanent at all.